It began, as such things so often do in St. Mary Mead, with something delightfully ordinary. The afternoon sun lay soft and golden upon the lawns of Gossamer Grange, and Mrs. Harriet Linton, a stout and cheerful hostess with a fondness for bright tablecloths, had outdone herself. There were cucumber sandwiches, lemon drizzle cake, and a particularly fine trifle which had already attracted the admiration of the vicar's wife. Miss Marple, seated a little apart beneath a parasol, sipped her tea with quiet contentment. Her blue eyes wandered across the gathering, not in judgment, but in that keen, gentle observation that had so often revealed to her the curious undercurrents of human life. It was an assembly of the usual village sort: the vicar and his wife, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, young Mrs. Ellis, recently moved from London, and, of course, the mysterious house guest of the week, Miss Sabine Roche. Miss Roche was the sort of woman who made one instinctively lower one's voice. Tall, dark, with the faintest trace of a foreign accent, she had arrived at Gossamer Grange only 3 days ago, bringing with her a trunk of peculiar objects that had already given rise to much speculation among the villagers. Mrs. Linton, with that unshakable chair peculiar to her class, had introduced the woman with barely concealed pride. "A real expert in antiques," she'd said, "especially foreign curiosities. She's helping me sort out a few heirlooms. Such knowledge of history." Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to distrust phrases like "such knowledge," watched the newcomer with mild interest. Miss Roche's long, tapering fingers were adorned with several rings, one in particular, a green stone shaped like an eye, which seemed almost alive when it caught the light. "Rather eccentric jewelry," murmured Mrs. Bantry to Miss Marple, following her gaze. "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly, "though sometimes people wear such things not out of taste, but out of sentiment or superstition." The older lady's remark might have gone unnoticed had not a small commotion arisen near the tea-table. Mrs. Ellis, the young Londoner, had given a sharp cry. Her little boy, no more than 6, had picked up an odd-looking doll from the wicker basket Miss Roche had brought along. It was about 8 inches high, carved from dark wood, with tiny beads for eyes and a tuft of grey hair stitched crudely into its head. "Darling, put that down," cried Mrs. Ellis, her voice trembling more than seemed warranted. "It's filthy." Miss Roche had risen at once, her hand outstretched, her tone icy but composed. "Please," she said, "that is not a toy." She took the doll carefully, almost reverently, as though it might shatter under too direct a glance. "It is very old. From Haiti. It carries meaning." The word hung in the air. An odd one, here among the roses and lace. A nervous laugh broke the silence. The vicar made a jocular remark about foreign customs, but the light-heartedness had already drained away. Mrs. Ellis apologized, pale and flustered. Miss Roche smiled, too calmly, and tucked the doll into her basket once more. Miss Marple, who had seen the fleeting terror in Mrs. Ellis's eyes, noted it quietly. There was something there, a story, perhaps, or a memory. Later that evening, when dusk began to fall over St. Mary Mead, the laughter from the garden had faded into the soft hum of insects. Mrs. Linton was collecting the last of the tea things when she realized her guest was missing. "Sabine?" she called out, peering toward the rose arbor. No reply, only the faint rustle of leaves. By the time the vicar and Colonel Bantry had joined the search, twilight had deepened into true night. They found her at last near the edge of the ornamental pond, lying quite still among the reeds, her hand clutching the Voodoo doll to her chest. Her eyes were wide open, and her expression was one of utter terror. Miss Marple, arriving moments later, said nothing. She only looked once at the strange little figure in the dead woman's hand, then at the faint indentation on the damp grass beside her body, as though someone else had stood there, very close, watching. And in that quiet, dreadful moment, as the lanterns swayed and whispered over the pond, Miss Marple thought to herself that murder, when it came to villages, never arrived as an intruder. It was always something grown from within. The following morning dawned with an uneasy quiet over St. Mary Mead, the kind that always followed a night of whispered speculation. The mist clung low to the hedgerows, and even the sparrows seemed subdued, as though aware that something dreadful had happened. News, of course, had travelled faster than reason. By breakfast time, the entire village knew that Miss Sabine Roche had been found dead at Gossamer Grange, and that she had died holding a peculiar doll. At the Blue Boar, Mrs. Bantry was already recounting the tale to an audience of 2, though her version had gained an element of theatrical horror. Clutching it she was, she declared, like a thing possessed, and that hair, human hair, I'd wager. The butcher's wife gasped audibly, and someone crossed themselves, which was rather out of character for St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, however, was not at the Blue Boar. She sat quietly at her breakfast table, her knitting on her lap, and thought about Mrs. Ellis. The young woman's face from the previous afternoon rose before her. The quick panic, the trembling hands. Fear, genuine and immediate, not the sort born from gossip. Miss Marple had seen that look before, many years ago, in another young woman who had received a letter she dared not show her husband. Fear of recognition, not surprise. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Cray, a capable enough man, though inclined to believe the obvious. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "Terrible business last night. Thought you might have noticed something, you being there and all." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One always notices something, Inspector. It's merely a question of what one chooses to remember." He frowned at that, but accepted the cup of tea she offered and settled into the armchair opposite her. "Dr. Haydock says it's heart failure. Natural, he thinks. But there are details. That doll, for instance. And Mrs. Linton swears she heard footsteps after everyone had gone in." "Natural causes seldom leave such expressions," Miss Marple murmured, half to herself. "And Sabine Roche, I think, was not a woman easily frightened." Cray leaned forward. "So you think it's murder?" "I think," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that something frightened her enough to stop her heart. Whether by malice or mischief remains to be seen. Tell me, Inspector, who was the last to see her alive?" He hesitated. "Mrs. Linton, most likely. Said Miss Roche had gone to fetch her shawl before leaving the garden. Never came back. And Mrs. Ellis?" He checked his notebook. "Left early, just after the incident with the doll. Said her son wasn't feeling well." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers stilling on the knitting needles. Children are often unwell when their mothers are troubled. The inspector looked puzzled, but let it pass. He was not used to Miss Marple's way of tracing crime through character rather than evidence. Later that morning, she took a quiet walk past Gossamer Grange. The constables had already been and gone, leaving muddy footprints along the path. Mrs. Linton herself stood in the doorway, her face pale beneath her powdered cheeks. "Oh, Miss Marple, such a dreadful thing," she exclaimed, wringing her hands. "I keep thinking of that poor woman's eyes. And the doll. They've taken it away, thank heavens." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Did Miss Roche seem anxious before she died? Distracted, perhaps?" Mrs. Linton shook her head. "Not anxious. Secretive, maybe. She told me she'd found something among my old trunks, something she said was valuable beyond price. She was going to show me after tea, but she never did." That small phrase lingered in Miss Marple's mind as she made her way home. Valuable beyond price. In her experience, such words could mean many things: money, love, revenge, or fear. That evening, as the lamps were lit across the village, she watched from her window as Mrs. Ellis hurried past again, the boy's hand clutched tightly in hers. She glanced about nervously before turning down the lane toward her cottage. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and reached for her shawl. Some mysteries, she thought, were better approached while the evening was young, and before the stories grew too tall to see the truth through them. The lane was narrow and quiet, lined with overgrown hedges that brushed against Miss Marple's sleeves as she walked. The air held the faint scent of damp earth and wood smoke, and a mist had begun to rise over the fields beyond. At such an hour, most of St. Mary Mead was behind drawn curtains, content with its own supper plates and radio chatter, but Miss Marple was not the sort to let the dark deter her when her mind was restless with unanswered questions. When she reached the Ellis cottage, she paused a moment at the gate. The blinds were half drawn, and through the small window she saw Mrs. Ellis at the table, her head bent low over something, perhaps a letter, perhaps merely her own trembling hands. The boy was nowhere in sight. Miss Marple waited a moment longer before gently tapping at the door. It opened with a start. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Ellis breathed, visibly flustered, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I wasn't expecting—" "I know, my dear," said Miss Marple softly. "But it's such a chill evening, and I thought perhaps a neighborly call mightn't go amiss. One oughtn't to sit alone after so distressing an event." For a moment the young woman looked ready to refuse. Then, as if the effort of pretending composure was too much, she stepped aside. "Yes, of course. Please, come in." The cottage smelled faintly of lavender polish and fear. The kettle whistled on the stove, and Miss Marple, ever practical, took it off before it screamed. She poured 2 cups and sat opposite the girl, who clasped her hands tightly around her tea, as if to steady them. "You mustn't think me foolish," Mrs. Ellis said after a silence. "It's just that what happened yesterday, it brought back something I'd rather forgotten, something I'd hoped never to see again." Miss Marple's eyes were kind but intent. "The doll?" The young woman nodded, her lips quivering. "Yes, I'd seen one like it before. Years ago, when I was living in Kingston with my first husband. He was involved in trade, importing curios and ornaments from the islands. There was a man who came to our home once, asking about a missing shipment. He had one of those dolls. Said it was cursed. My husband laughed, said it was all nonsense. A month later, he was found dead. Heart failure, they said, though he was only 30. The words trembled into the air, half confession, half plea. Miss Marple listened without interruption, only nodding once, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her teacup. "And this Miss Roach," she said at last, "did she ever meet your husband?" Mrs. Ellis shook her head quickly. "No, at least I don't think so. But when she saw me yesterday— oh, Miss Marple, she knew me. I could see it in her face. She smiled in a way that chilled me to the bone, as though she knew something I didn't want remembered." A clock ticked in the corner. Miss Marple set down her cup gently. "I see. So perhaps she didn't come to St. Mary Mead by chance." The younger woman's eyes widened. "You mean she sought me out?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said softly. "Some people travel very far to deliver messages, or to settle unfinished business." She stood, pulling her shawl tighter. "You've been very brave, my dear, but I would suggest you lock your doors tonight. Sometimes fear makes us careless." When Miss Marple stepped back into the lane, the mist had thickened. Lamps flickered dimly along the street, and the world felt smaller, muffled. She walked home with her thoughts arranged neatly, as one might fold linen in a drawer. Back at her cottage, she found a note slipped under her door, a rare enough occurrence in St. Mary Mead to make her heart quicken. The paper was folded twice and written in a hurried, uneven hand. "If you value the truth, tell the inspector to look in Mrs. Linton's attic before it's too late." There was no signature, only a faint smudge where the ink had bled, as though written by someone with trembling fingers, or in great haste. Miss Marple read the note twice, then placed it beneath the lamp. Outside, the church bell tolled 9. Somewhere, a dog barked. and in that still, anxious moment she felt the faint stirring of certainty. Someone in St. Mary Mead was hiding more than guilt. They were hiding history. Miss Marple sat very still for several minutes after reading the note, the faint ticking of her mantel clock the only sound in the cottage. She had lived long enough to know that anonymous warnings rarely came from noble intentions, but they always came from proximity. Whoever had slipped that folded piece of paper beneath her door had known she would be home, had known she was quietly watching, and, more importantly, had known something she was not supposed to. She rose, lit another lamp, and studied the handwriting more closely. The letters were uneven, some oddly slanted, as though written by someone unused to writing quickly. The ink, however, was not of the usual blue-black variety one might find in a house pen. It was brown, faintly rust-colored, and had dried unevenly at the edges. She frowned. Such ink was uncommon now. It had the look of something older, as if taken from a bottle forgotten in a drawer. She tucked the note into her knitting basket just as a light knock sounded at her door. Opening it, she found Inspector Cray standing on the step, his hat in his hands, his face drawn from lack of sleep. "Evening, Miss Marple. I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but there's been another development." "I rather suspected there might," she said calmly. "Do come in. I have tea that hasn't yet lost its warmth." He accepted, and as he sat, she noted the small smudge of dust on his cuff, a pale, powdery sort, not from the road, but more likely from a house left untended. He caught her glance and sighed. "We've been through the Grange from top to bottom," he said. "Nothing conclusive, except, well, there's something you might find peculiar. We found a small wooden box in Miss Roche's room, locked tight, the keys nowhere to be seen." "Describe it," Miss Marple said. "Mahogany, about 6 inches across, odd carvings along the edge. Could be decorative, could be foreign." Miss Marple's expression hardly changed. "And what, may I ask, has become of Mrs. Linton?" "She's been in bed most of the day," Cray replied. "Doctor says shock. Keeps saying Miss Roche meant her no harm, that she was only helping with the antiques." Miss Marple nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already half suspected. She poured him a cup of tea, then said lightly, "Tell me, Inspector, did you look in her attic?" He blinked. "Her attic? No, why should we?" "I wonder," Miss Marple murmured, "if it might not be worth a glance. Things one hides, one seldom hides in plain sight." He gave her a long look. "You've heard something?" "One hears a great many things in a small village," she replied, "but it's so easy to dismiss them as gossip until they stop being harmless." The inspector hesitated only a moment before standing. "All right, I'll have a look first thing in the morning." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Do take a torch, Inspector. Attics have a way of revealing themselves only in the right light." After he left, she sat by the window, her knitting untouched. Across the square, the light in Mrs. Linton's upstairs room glowed faintly against the curtain, flickering now and then as though from a candle rather than a lamp. Odd, Miss Marple thought, that a woman claiming to be in bed with shock should sit awake at such an hour. The following morning broke pale and cold. By the time Miss Marple reached Gossamer Grange, Inspector Cray was already there, his men stationed about the garden. Mrs. Linton, pale and nervous in her dressing gown, stood wringing her hands on the doorstep. "It's dreadful, simply dreadful," she kept saying. "All this fuss, when the poor woman's barely buried." "Indeed," Miss Marple said quietly, stepping past her. "Though sometimes, my dear Mrs. Linton, the dead insist upon a little fuss before they rest." The attic door creaked open under Cray's hand. Dust floated in the air like pale smoke, and a faint scent of camphor hung about the beams. At first glance, it was the usual collection of forgotten things: trunks, old lamps, yellowed newspapers. Then one of the constables gave a low whistle. "Sir, look at this." He pointed toward the far corner where a chest sat half hidden beneath a moth-eaten quilt. Cray pulled the covering away, revealing a row of objects laid carefully inside. Small carved figures, all of them dark wood, their faces painted with symbols. Each one was eerily similar to the doll Miss Roach had held when she died. Mrs. Linton gave a strangled gasp. Those aren't mine. They must have been left here by whoever owned the house before. But Miss Marple was no longer looking at the dolls. Her gaze had fallen upon the corner of the chest, where a small brown ink bottle rested beside a torn scrap of paper of the same quality, the same faint discoloration, as the note left at her door. She leaned slightly toward Inspector Cray. "You see, my dear, I think someone in this house has been writing warnings in the night. The question is, were they warning us to prevent a murder, or to cover one?" Cray looked grim. "Either way, Miss Marple, someone's gone to great lengths to hide the truth." Miss Marple smiled, though her eyes were thoughtful. "Yes," she said softly, "and perhaps the truth is not hiding at all. It's merely waiting for us to notice which lies are trembling in its shadow." The discovery of the attic lingered in everyone's mind like a half-remembered nightmare. Even the constables, practical men unshaken by most things, found themselves glancing more often over their shoulders as they descended the stairs. Mrs. Linton, clutching her shawl, insisted she knew nothing about the figures, her voice quivering between panic and outrage. Inspector Cray made a few calm notes, his tone deliberately mild, but his eyes had hardened. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stood by the window, looking out over the garden where the morning mist still hung low over the pond. Her attention drifted to the edge of the reeds where Miss Roach's body had been found. The water there was strangely still, reflecting the grayness of the sky like tarnished glass. "Those dolls," Cray muttered beside her. "What do you make of them? Ritual objects? Tokens? It's madness." Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. "Madness, perhaps, but not without purpose. People don't keep such things by chance, Inspector. They mean something to someone, and meaning, I've found, is far more dangerous than superstition." She turned toward Mrs. Linton, who was still protesting weakly. "You said, my dear, that Miss Roach had found something valuable in your trunks. Was this attic ever mentioned between you?" Mrs. Linton hesitated. "She asked, I suppose. Said she liked to look where history sleeps. Those were her words. But I told her there was nothing up there but dust and spiders." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "History does tend to sleep in the most inconvenient places." The inspector ordered the dolls to be taken as evidence. As they were carried out, one of them slipped from the constable's gloved hand and rolled across the floor, coming to rest against Miss Marple's shoe. She bent to pick it up, examining the tiny wooden face with its crooked, painted smile. There was a faint smell, strange and metallic, almost like rust. She turned it in the light and noticed a dark stain near its base. She held it out. "Inspector, this doll was not always an ornament. It's been handled recently. See here, blood most likely. Miss Roach may not have been the only one to touch it that night." Cray took it grimly, wrapping it in cloth. "I'll have it examined. You think she was killed with one of these things?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple said quietly. "I think she was frightened to death. But fright rarely acts alone. It's helped along, often by someone who knows exactly how to use it." Mrs. Linton gave a strangled cry. "You can't think Miss Roach was my guest." "My dear Mrs. Linton," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle, "no one has said otherwise, but fear has a peculiar way of spreading. Sometimes it begins in friendship." They left her trembling in her drawing room, and as Miss Marple stepped outside, she saw Mrs. Ellis approaching from down the lane, the child clinging to her hand. The woman's face was pale, drawn taut as a parchment. When she saw Miss Marple, she stopped abruptly. "I heard," she said, her voice low. "They found more of them, didn't they? Dolls like the one she had?" "Yes," Miss Marple answered softly. "Many of them. Tell me, my dear, did you ever know a woman named Sabine Roche before she came here?" Mrs. Ellis looked away, a faint tremor passing through her. Not by name, but I think she knew my husband. There was a letter once, years ago, signed only S.R. He burned it before I could read it. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with quiet understanding. And you never asked him about it? I did. He said it was business. He said it meant nothing. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind rustling faintly through the hedges. Then Mrs. Ellis whispered, "She wasn't here by accident, was she? She came because of me." Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Whether by design or by destiny, I cannot say. But it seems the past has a very stubborn habit of finding its way home. The sound of hurried footsteps broke their quiet exchange. A young constable was running from the house toward the inspector, a folded piece of paper in his hand. "Sir, found this tucked behind the attic chest," he called. Cray opened it, his brow furrowing as he read. "It's a receipt from a shipping company in London. Roche Imports. The date's from 15 years ago." He paused. "And it's signed, Henry Ellis." Mrs. Ellis swayed, catching her breath. The little boy began to cry softly, his hand slipping from hers. Miss Marple steadied her, one hand on her arm. "You see, Inspector," she said quietly, "the web was spun long before any of us noticed the silk." Cray nodded grimly. "And now, Miss Marple, it seems we'll have to find out just how far this web still stretches." Miss Marple's eyes turned toward the pond once more, the reflection of the sky darkening as clouds gathered. "Yes," she murmured. "But be careful, Inspector. When one tugs at threads, one must be quite certain who's holding the other end." That evening brought with it a hush over the village, as though the air itself were listening. Rain began to fall, not heavily, but in a thin, persistent drizzle that made the cobbles glisten beneath the lamplight. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched, watching the faint ripple of reflections in the puddles. Somewhere beyond the square, the sound of the church clock drifted faintly through the damp night. The discovery of Henry Ellis's name on that receipt had changed everything. It had given form to what had so far been only suggestion, proof that Sabine Roche's arrival had not been random, that her death was tied to old transactions and older betrayals. But Miss Marple was not yet satisfied. "Motives," she often said, "are like weeds. One must follow the roots all the way down." A soft knock startled her from her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found Mrs. Linton standing there, her hair damp from the rain, her expression taut with nerves. "Miss Marple, I had to speak to someone," she began breathlessly. "They've been talking, saying dreadful things, that I knew what was in that attic, that I was part of it, but I swear I didn't. Miss Roche, she insisted on searching the house. She said something was hidden here, something that belonged to her. I told her she was mistaken, but she wouldn't listen." Miss Marple gestured her inside, her voice gentle but firm. "Sit down, Mrs. Linton. Tell me everything, from the beginning. Slowly, if you please." The woman clasped her hands together tightly. "It started a week ago. She came with a letter of introduction. From a London dealer, she said. Claimed she was tracing the history of a collection that once belonged to an old shipping family. She seemed harmless enough, though there was something watchful about her. She spent hours in the attic, sorting through trunks. Then 2 days before the party, she came to me, her hands shaking, and said she'd found what she was looking for. A relic, she called it. She wouldn't tell me what it was." Miss Marple nodded, the lines on her face deepening in thought. "And afterward, did she seem afraid?" "Yes," Mrs. Linton whispered. "Terribly so. She kept her room locked. That last evening before the party, I heard her crying, and when I asked what was wrong, she said something strange. They always find you, even if you bury the past under 1,000 names." I didn't understand. Miss Marple regarded her for a long moment. "Did she ever mention Henry Ellis?" Mrs. Linton blinked. The man from the receipt? No. But she did speak once of a partner, a man who had cheated her. She said he'd stolen something meant for her safekeeping, then disappeared after an unfortunate incident. I didn't press for details. As Mrs. Linton spoke, Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the small vase of dried flowers on the mantelpiece. Among the faded stems was a single sprig of heather, recently cut, still faintly green. Odd, she thought. Mrs. Linton wasn't the type for country walks. Someone had been in the garden today. Before she could speak, the knock came again, louder this time. Inspector Cray entered without ceremony, his coat dripping. He looked grim. "We've had another development," he said. "A break-in at the late Miss Roche's lodgings. Her trunk's been forced open. Most of her papers are gone." Mrs. Linton gasped. "Gone? But who would—" "Someone who knew what to look for," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "Was anything left behind, Inspector?" He hesitated. "Just one scrap, burned around the edges. Looks like it was torn from a letter. It mentions a consignment and a transfer of ownership. Signed again with the same initials, S.R." Mrs. Linton buried her face in her hands. "Dear heaven, what does it all mean?" Miss Marple rose, her voice low but steady. "It means, my dear, that Miss Roche was not here merely as a collector of curios. She was a witness, and someone in St. Mary Mead was desperate that her memory never reached London." Cray frowned. "You think she was blackmailing someone?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. She was seeking restitution, but restitution can look very much like revenge to those who feel its shadow." A flash of lightning illuminated the window, followed by a deep, rolling rumble that shook the glass. The rain thickened, hammering against the panes. Cray turned toward the door. "I'll have a man stationed here tonight. Whoever's behind this won't stop at theft." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That's kind of you, Inspector, but unnecessary. I don't believe they'll come for me." Cray paused. "Why not?" "Because," she said softly, turning toward the flickering firelight, "they think they already have what they wanted, and that, you see, is always the moment they make their greatest mistake." Outside, the storm deepened, swallowing the village in darkness. But within Miss Marple's small sitting room, her eyes shone with quiet purpose. She knew now where to look next, and whom to watch when the morning came. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle stillness. The village roofs glistened beneath a washed-out sky, and the hedges along the lanes drooped with rainwater. It was a deceptive calm, the kind that made people speak softly, as though the air still remembered what it had carried through the night. Miss Marple was up early. She had barely slept, her thoughts turning over the fragments that had surfaced, the shipping receipt, the hidden doles, the burned letter, and above all, the faint scent of rusted ink that clung to the note slipped beneath her door. She moved methodically, as she always did when nearing a conclusion, not rushing toward it, but circling, letting the truth rise naturally like cream in a bowl of milk. By the time Inspector Cray arrived, she already had tea prepared. He looked weary, but purposeful. "Morning, Miss Marple. Thought I'd stop by before heading to the station. There's been a development of sorts. Mrs. Ellis and the boy, they're gone. Left before dawn." Miss Marple didn't look surprised. "People rarely flee unless they think they'll be believed guilty," she said. "Or unless they know something that makes them afraid to stay." Cray sighed. "Her neighbor says she packed light. Only one trunk and the child's coat. No one's seen her since." "She'll be found," Miss Marple murmured. "Fear doesn't travel far. It circles back to the place where it began." She rose, moving toward the window, her gaze drifting toward the direction of the old railway line. "She'll go somewhere quiet, somewhere that feels safe, perhaps a place she used to visit with her husband." Cray rubbed his forehead. "We'll check the stations. Meanwhile, I've sent for the London shipping office mentioned on that receipt. If Ellis and Roche were involved in anything shady 15 years ago, someone there might remember. Miss Marple nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. "Tell me, Inspector, did anyone examine the pond after the storm?" "The pond?" He frowned. "We dragged it the night of the death. Nothing there." "Oh, but that was before the rain," she said softly. "And rain, you know, has a way of loosening what the earth prefers to keep quiet." An hour later, they stood together by the edge of the ornamental pond at Gossamer Grange. The water had turned muddy and restless from the downpour, and the reeds bent under their own weight. A constable waded in cautiously, his boots sinking into the soft silt. Then came a shout, a dull metallic sound as his spade struck something hard beneath the surface. Cray knelt as they pulled it free. It was a small iron chest, sealed with a corroded clasp. The inspector pried it open, grimacing as the hinges groaned. Inside lay a bundle of papers, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. And something else, smaller and darker. Miss Marple leaned closer. "Ah," she said quietly. "So that's where it was." The small wooden doll, identical to the others, stared up at them with its bead-like eyes. But unlike the rest, this one bore a brass plate fastened to its back. The inscription, worn but legible, read, "Ellis and Roche, Trading Co., 1911. Cray exhaled slowly. "Well, that settles it. They were partners. Looks like these dolls were part of their merchandise." "Yes," Miss Marple said, studying the doll, "but not ordinary merchandise. These were smuggled, perhaps containing something valuable or dangerous. Sabine Roche must have come here to recover what had been hidden, and she found only betrayal waiting." As they examined the papers, one document caught Cray's eye, a letter addressed to H.E., written in Sabine Roche's elegant hand. It spoke of unfinished accounts, of guilt, of something that had to be returned to its rightful place. The final lines were underlined twice. "If you will not come forward, I shall go to the woman who keeps your name." Cray looked up. "The woman who keeps your name. That's Mrs. Ellis." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, sorrowful smile. "Yes. Miss Roche was never looking for vengeance, Inspector. She wanted acknowledgement, but someone feared exposure, and fear, once stirred, leads to desperate acts." He folded the letter carefully. "So Mrs. Ellis ran because she thought we'd accuse her?" "Or because she realized someone else already had," Miss Marple said. "The murderer is not running. They're waiting, quite certain the storm has passed." Cray glanced at her sharply. "You think it's someone still here?" "Oh, quite," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Murderers rarely go far from their handiwork. It's the living who flee. The guilty, however, they linger." She looked toward the upper window of Gossamer Grange, where a faint shadow moved behind the lace curtains. The shape was familiar, Mrs. Linton's, pale and restless, peering down at them. Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "And sometimes," she said softly, "the truth waits in the very room where death first entered, hoping we'll be brave enough to knock." The faint movement behind the curtain vanished as Miss Marple looked up, though she caught the lingering sway of the lace, just enough to confirm what she already suspected. Mrs. Linton had been watching them. There was nothing unusual about that, of course. People in small villages always watched when the police came calling. But Miss Marple had seen the difference between curiosity and anxiety. One was casual, the other trembled. Inspector Cray followed her gaze. "You think she's hiding something up there?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her tone was firm. "I think, Inspector, that Mrs. Linton has been hiding something for quite some time, though I suspect she's not entirely aware of the danger it brings her now." They walked back toward the house. The garden looked weary under the grey light, the pond rippling faintly behind them as though whispering its own secrets. When Mrs. Linton opened the door, her expression was composed, but her eyes flickered briefly to the chest in Cray's hands before she could stop herself. "More rummaging?" she asked, attempting a brittle smile. "I suppose you'll be wanting to search the rest of the house next." "We might," Cray said evenly. "But perhaps you could save us the trouble by explaining why there's a trading company's mark on a doll found in your pond." Mrs. Linton's composure faltered. "I told you, I had no idea." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice quiet, but cutting through the air like a fine blade. "My dear, it's far easier to say one knows nothing than to admit one knew only enough to be frightened. I think Miss Roach told you more than you wished to. Here." There was a pause. The ticking of the hallway clock seemed to grow louder. Mrs. Linton looked at Miss Marple as though she might protest, but the older woman's calm gaze held her still. Finally, she spoke in a low, shaking voice. "She came to me that evening," Mrs. Linton whispered, "just before the party. She said she'd discovered proof that her former partner had smuggled things through England under false manifests, using items like those dolls. She said one of the dolls contained something incriminating, a list hidden in the hollow inside. And she wanted your help finding it," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Linton nodded. "I thought it was nonsense. I told her as much. She became agitated. Said if I didn't help, others would come looking. She mentioned a name, Ellis, and asked if I knew anyone by it. Of course I said no. But the next morning, she was dead." Cray's jaw tightened. "And you didn't think to mention this before?" "I was frightened," Mrs. Linton cried. "You don't understand. After she died, I went to the attic and found that chest. I saw the dolls, the strange carvings. I wanted to tell you, but then someone left a note on my doorstep. It said, 'Keep silent, or you'll join her in the pond.'" The words hung heavily in the air. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her hands clasped a little tighter on her handbag. "Do you still have that note?" Cray asked quickly. Mrs. Linton hesitated, then shook her head. "I burned it. I couldn't bear the sight of it." Miss Marple's voice was almost kind. "And yet someone else found courage enough to warn me in the same ink that wrote your threat. You see, Mrs. Linton, fear often disguises its author. The hand that frightens you may be the same one pretending to protect." Mrs. Linton stared at her blankly, trying to grasp the meaning. Cray, meanwhile, frowned in thought. If Roche was threatening to expose Ellis, and Ellis is dead, then who would still have a reason to keep her silent? Miss Marple turned toward the window, watching the drizzle return in faint silver threads. "The answer, Inspector, lies not in the dead man's guilt, but in who profited from his disappearance. Smuggling rings, especially ones with a veneer of respectability, seldom die with their founders." Cray looked startled. "You mean there's someone still running it?" "Oh, indeed," she said softly. "And if I'm not mistaken, that someone has been keeping a very polite distance while ensuring we all look the wrong way." She crossed to the small side table where a single envelope lay among Mrs. Linton's scattered correspondence. Miss Marple lifted it delicately. "This was delivered yesterday morning, I think. The handwriting. See how it leans to the left? The same peculiar slope as the note I received." Mrs. Linton stared. "It's from my solicitor, Mr. Vane." Cray frowned. "Your solicitor?" Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with quiet certainty. "Yes, Inspector, and I believe Mr. Vane was once Mr. Henry Ellis's business partner before he changed his name. Quite a convenient arrangement, wouldn't you say, to manage the estate of a widow whose attic concealed the evidence of your past?" The silence that followed was heavy, almost reverent. Then Cray's eyes hardened. "If you're right, Miss Marple, he's been one step ahead of us from the start." She nodded slowly. "Not for much longer, I think. You see, men like Mr. Vane make one mistake. They underestimate the power of a woman who listened." She looked once more toward the rain-blurred street where the postman was making his slow way toward the village square. "And I suspect," she added softly, "that today's post will tell us just how desperate Mr. Vane has become." The postman's knock came a short while later, sharp and businesslike, echoing through the hall of Gossamer Grange. Mrs. Linton, still pale from the confrontation, moved to take the letters with trembling hands, but Miss Marple intercepted them gently. "Allow me, my dear. I find it's best to let official matters pass through a steadier grip." There were 3 envelopes. 2 were harmless enough. One a circular from the Ladies' Garden Society, the other a bill for coal. But the third, heavy cream paper sealed with red wax, bore a name written in the same left-leaning hand Miss Marple had just pointed out, Mrs. Harriet Linton. The handwriting was smooth, practiced, and carried the faint arrogance of someone accustomed to authority. Inspector Cray hovered at her shoulder. "Shall we?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Linton gave a quick nod. Miss Marple slit the envelope with the silver edge of her knitting needle and unfolded the letter. The scent of expensive ink rose faintly. She read in silence, her expression unchanging, though her eyes narrowed slightly with each line. Then she handed it to Cray. He read aloud. "My dear Mrs. Linton, I strongly advise you to remain calm and to say nothing further to the authorities. The matter concerning Miss Roche's death is being handled privately, and any unnecessary interference could lead to consequences most regrettable. For you and others involved. Destroy this note immediately after reading. Yours sincerely, R. Vane." Cray let out a low whistle. "Well, that's as good as a confession." "Not quite," Miss Marple said softly. "It's the letter of a man who still believes himself safe. He would not write at all if he thought the walls were closing in." "No, Inspector. He's warning her because he's frightened she might talk before he has time to act." Mrs. Linton clasped her shawl tighter. He wouldn't harm me, surely." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "My dear, men who live by deceit will do whatever is required to keep their lies intact. But the advantage we have is that Mr. Vane believes you still frightened enough to obey him." Cray folded the letter carefully, already calculating. "I'll have him brought in at once. We can charge him with intimidation at the very least." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. Not yet. If we move too soon, he'll deny everything and have time to destroy whatever proof remains. I suggest instead that we invite him here. Let him believe Mrs. Linton wishes to discuss her predicament. You and your men can listen unseen." Cray hesitated, then nodded slowly. "A trap, then." "A conversation," Miss Marple corrected. "One that reveals who's been pulling the strings since the day Miss Roche arrived in this village." An hour later, arrangements were made. The constables withdrew to the adjoining parlor, leaving the sitting room empty but for Miss Marple, Mrs. Linton, and a single cup of tea cooling on the table. The air felt tight with anticipation. Rain tapped faintly against the windows again, the sound rhythmic and deliberate, as though echoing the quiet patience of the woman seated by the fire. At precisely 4 o'clock, the sound of a motor car approached up the gravel drive. Miss Marple did not rise. She only tilted her head slightly as the doorbell rang. A moment later, the butler ushered in a tall man in a dark coat, his manner controlled and faintly disdainful. His graying hair was perfectly groomed, his gloves spotless. "Mrs. Linton," he said, bowing slightly. "You wish to see me? I trust this is discreet." Miss Marple regarded him with mild interest. "We do hope so, Mr. Vane." "Tea?" He started at the sound of her voice, his composure slipping for the briefest instant. "Ah, Miss Marple, I wasn't aware you were assisting in this matter." "Oh, merely observing," she replied pleasantly. "I find the truth often prefers company." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Truth, Miss Marple, is an elusive creature, and sometimes dangerous when mishandled." Mrs. Linton, visibly trembling, handed him the letter. I don't understand any of this, Mr. Vane. Why did you tell me not to speak? What are you afraid I'll say?" Vane's smile tightened. "Only that you might repeat things you don't understand. The late Miss Roche was a disturbed woman, Mrs. Linton. She came here chasing ghosts, imaginary debts, imagined wrongs. It would be a pity if her delusions caused trouble for respectable people. Miss Marple watched him closely. His eyes did not waver, but his hands, those carefully gloved hands, had tightened on the letter. Respectable people seldom write threatening notes, she observed mildly. Vane turned toward her, his tone sharpening. "You misinterpret my concern, madam. I was protecting Mrs. Linton from scandal." "Ah, but whose scandal, I wonder?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet, almost kind, yet every word landed with precision. "You see, Mr. Vane, I happen to know that you were once a partner of a certain Henry Ellis, until a disagreement over certain shipments sent your name into ruin. You changed it, of course. Reinvented yourself here. It was all quite tidy, until Miss Roche came seeking what she was owed." Vane froze. For a heartbeat, his polished mask wavered. Then he laughed softly, though the sound was brittle. "That's an impressive fantasy, Miss Marple, but you have no proof." From the doorway, Inspector Cray stepped forward, holding the iron chest and the letter found in the pond. "On the contrary," he said evenly, "we have plenty." For a long moment, no one spoke. The ticking of the clock filled the room. Then Vane's face hardened. "You old fool," he hissed under his breath. "You think you can undo 15 years with a few scraps of paper?" Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "No, Mr. Vane, not paper. Truth, and the truth, once surfaced, has a way of breathing on its own." He made a sudden move toward the door, but the constables were already there. The struggle was brief, and when he was led away moments later, his eyes met Miss Marple's, cold, bitter, and defeated. When the door closed, Mrs. Linton sank into her chair, trembling. "Is it over?" she whispered. Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean once more. "Yes, my dear," she said softly. "For now. But one should never think evil ends entirely. It merely waits for the next shadow to give it form again." And as the evening light crept gently through the glass, the quiet of St. Mary Mead returned, not untouched, but a little wiser than before. The following morning dawned clearer than it had in days, though the calm that settled over St. Mary Mead felt deceptive, too still, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The news of Mr. Vane's arrest had traveled with the swiftness peculiar to small places. By breakfast, every shopkeeper and housemaid knew that Miss Marple had once again been involved in unearthing a dreadful business. Yet for all the whispered satisfaction that justice had been served, Miss Marple herself felt no such ease. She sat at her small kitchen table, her teacup cooling untouched beside her. A thin ribbon of sunlight fell across the newspaper spread before her, the ink still fresh enough to smudge at the fingertips. "Solicitor held in connection with local death," the headline read. It was all quite factual, polite, and incomplete, like a village obituary that left out the scandalous parts everyone already knew. But it wasn't the article that troubled her. It was what wasn't there. Her eyes lingered on the final paragraph. "Police confirm a woman known as Mrs. Ellis remains missing. Search efforts continue." Miss Marple folded the paper carefully, her brows knitting. She had expected as much. Fear had driven Mrs. Ellis to run, yes, but fear was a poor traveling companion. It tired easily, and sooner or later it turned into guilt. A soft knock came at the door, just as the clock chimed 8. It was Inspector Cray, looking as though he hadn't slept much. His manner, though respectful, carried that uneasy restlessness of a man who felt the story had ended too neatly. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "I won't trouble you long. Just thought you should know. Vane's talking." Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. "I rather thought he might, once he realized how little the law fears a man of polite manners." Cray managed a weary smile. "He's admitted to the smuggling, yes. Said Ellis and Roche ran it together before things fell apart. But he swears he had nothing to do with her death." Claims he only came here to recover documents that could incriminate him. Says she was alive when he last saw her. And yet, Miss Marple murmured, the pond tells a different story. Cray sighed. We can't prove he killed her. There's no physical evidence, no marks, no weapon. Dr. Haydock still insists it was heart failure. Indeed, Miss Marple said softly. Heart failure. But hearts don't simply fail without a reason, Inspector. Sometimes they are persuaded. He looked at her sharply. You mean frightened? Precisely, she replied, rising to fetch another teapot from the shelf. Sabine Roche was not an ordinary woman. She'd lived among people who traded in fear, superstition, power, secrets. She would have recognized a threat when she saw one. But she wouldn't have expected it from someone she trusted. Cray frowned. You think there's someone else? I think, Miss Marple said, pouring the tea, that Mrs. Linton's role in all this has not quite ended. A woman like that doesn't burn threatening letters and hide dolls in her attic unless she has been told, quite firmly, that silence will keep her safe. The inspector rubbed his temple. But Vane's in custody now. Who else would she be afraid of? Miss Marple gave him a long, thoughtful look. Fear, Inspector, doesn't always vanish when the source is gone. Sometimes it lingers, because the victim has learned to create it herself. You see, Mrs. Linton may not have killed Miss Roche, but I do believe she helped her die. Cray stared. You mean she? Not intentionally, Miss Marple interrupted gently. But when a frightened woman is begged for help and instead offers indifference, that can be quite as deadly as a blow. Guilt, I've found, has a strange way of festering in such hearts. A silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the faint rattle of rain beginning again against the window panes. Cray leaned back, exhaling slowly. You know, Miss Marple, sometimes I think you pity these people too much. She smiled faintly. Not pity, Inspector. Understanding. The two are often mistaken for one another. He rose, tipping his hat. We'll keep searching for Mrs. Ellis. I'll send word if she's found. Do, she said kindly, but I doubt you'll need to look far. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the church spire, Miss Marple took her customary walk through the village. The air was damp and fragrant with late roses, and the road to the Grange lay quiet beneath the shade of tall elms. Near the bend by the vicarage, she saw a figure standing beside the low stone wall, small, thin, clutching a boy's hand. Mrs. Ellis. Her coat was travel-stained, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights, but when she saw Miss Marple, she did not flee. She only said in a tired, hoarse voice, I didn't know where else to go. Miss Marple reached out, her voice soft and steady. You've come exactly where you were meant to, my dear. And though the evening air was cool and still, there was something in the way Mrs. Ellis's shoulders trembled that told Miss Marple the final confession was near. Whatever truth remained in the shadows of St. Mary Mead had followed her back, and before the night was over, it would finally speak. The little boy clung to his mother's hand as if afraid she might vanish again. They stood together beneath the low grey sky, the wind stirring the last few leaves from the hedgerow. Miss Marple regarded them quietly, her gaze filled with patience rather than judgment. Come, she said gently, leading them toward her cottage. You look as though a warm fire and a pot of tea might remind you that the world is still capable of kindness. Inside, the air carried the faint, comforting scent of lavender polish and coal smoke. Mrs. Ellis sat where Miss Marple motioned, her eyes darting nervously to the clock, the door, and finally to the boy. She seemed smaller than before, her defiance worn away by sleeplessness and guilt. When she finally spoke, her voice came in fragments, like someone unburdening memories long buried under fear. I didn't mean for her to die, she whispered. Sabine came to me that night. She said she'd finally found proof. Something that would clear my husband's name. He wasn't the thief, she said. It was Vane. He'd stolen the last consignment and blamed Henry for it. She said she had the papers and would bring them in the morning. Miss Marple poured her a cup of tea, her movements calm and deliberate. And what happened then? Mrs. Ellis looked down at her trembling hands. There was a knock not long after she left me. I thought it was her returning, but it was Mrs. Linton. She said Sabine had gone back to the pond, that she'd been upset. She wanted me to come and fetch her. I was terrified. I thought it was a trap that they meant to drag me into it. So I stayed. I did nothing. And in the morning, they said she was dead. Her voice broke then, raw and small. If I'd just gone to her, Miss Marple sighed softly. Perhaps she would have lived long enough to tell you what you needed to hear, but we cannot rewrite the past, my dear. Only understand the truth of it. She reached for the folded packet that Inspector Cray had left with her that morning, the recovered papers from the iron chest. She slid them across the table. Here. These are what she died protecting. They prove that your husband's signature was forged, that Vane manipulated the accounts to cover his own theft. He let Henry take the blame. And the ruin. Mrs. Ellis took the papers with shaking hands, her eyes filling as she read. It was as though years of silence and shame had suddenly cracked open, letting grief and relief spill together. She was trying to make it right, she whispered. All this time she was trying to help me. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and I believe she forgave you, even before she went to the water. That's why she held the doll so tightly. It wasn't superstition. It was a symbol of what had bound them both. Trust, once broken, waiting to be restored. A knock came at the door, brisk and familiar. Inspector Cray stepped inside, his expression softening as he saw the scene. So it's true, then? He asked quietly. Vane's confessed to everything. His partner's been taken in London too. The smuggling ring's finished. Miss Marple inclined her head. Evil seldom ends cleanly, Inspector, but it does have a way of exposing itself in the end. He smiled faintly. And what of her? He nodded toward Mrs. Ellis, who sat clutching the documents like a lifeline. Miss Marple's tone was gentle. She will stay here for a time. The law has no quarrel with grief, and I think St. Mary Mead will learn to keep its gossip to itself for once. Cray looked as though he might argue, but then thought better of it. He tipped his hat instead and left quietly, the door closing behind him. For a long while there was silence save for the steady ticking of the clock. The fire crackled softly, throwing warmth across the small sitting room. Mrs. Ellis reached for her son's hand, drawing him close. "Thank you," she said hoarsely, "for everything." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind and distant. "One does what one must, my dear. It's no trouble. But remember, truth, when it finally arrives, is seldom comforting. It merely sets things in their proper place." Later, when they had gone, she tidied the tea things and returned to her chair by the window. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, and the village carried on with its quiet rhythm. Postman at his round, baker at his oven, and children laughing on the green as though nothing dreadful had ever happened there. Miss Marple watched it all with a faint, thoughtful smile. She had seen so many endings, and yet none ever truly ended. Each left its faint trace in the fabric of the village, the whispered memory of guilt, the shadow of remorse, the rare glimmer of understanding. She took up her knitting again, her hands steady and sure. Human nature, she murmured to herself. So very curious and so very predictable. And as the afternoon light faded over St. Mary Mead, the quiet detective of the village returned to her gentle rhythm, the mystery resolved, the truth restored, and the world, at least for now, at peace once more.